the mad mechanic who turned a broken tank into an engineering legend. On a cold morning in early June of 1944, somewhere beyond the smoke drifting over Normandy's farmland, an American tank lay cracked open like a giant steel carcass. The war had been raging for months, but what destroyed this vehicle wasn't a German shell, a mine, or even a hidden gunner. It was the ground itself, not the enemy, not a weapon, just the terrain. And that was the most terrifying part. Men who survived the inferno said it felt like driving straight into a trap built centuries before tanks were even imagined. The earth rose in front of them, deceptively ordinary. Low ridges, overgrown hedges, tangles of roots older than the United States itself. Then the tank tilted, its belly lifted into the air like an offering. A split second later, armor that was never meant to be exposed became a glaring target. Fire, explosion, screams. Another crew gone. The battlefield of Normandy, celebrated in American newspapers as the gateway to liberation, had turned into a mechanical graveyard long before General Eisenhower reached the front lines. Tanks burned not in clusters, but in patterns, each wreck positioned the same grotesque way. Nose up, underbelly ruptured, turret twisted toward the sky. It looked less like warfare and more like a methodical execution. Soldiers blamed everything except what was truly responsible. They cursed the German infantry. They blamed bad luck, poor visibility, sabotage, even divine wrath. But none of them realized what the terrain was silently doing to them. None of them, except for the quiet sergeant standing knee-deep in the blackened mud beside that broken tank. Curtis Cullen, 30 years old, former mechanic from New Jersey, stared at the wreck with the unsettling calm of someone who wasn't shocked anymore. He had seen this too many times, too many identical breaches, too many identical angles of destruction. He knew enough about machinery to understand when a failure was random, and when it was repeated with precision. The hedgerows of Normandy were not what the map suggested. These weren't simple vegetation lines drawn between farms. They were ancient earthen barricades, built over hundreds of years, compacted by storms, coated in roots thick as a man's wrist, reinforced by stones dragged from fields long before the American Revolution. Some stood nearly 15 feet tall. Viewed from above, they formed an endless labyrinth, a patchwork of traps waiting for anything foolish enough to climb them. Every attempt by American armored units to crest those ridges resulted in the same predictable catastrophe. The tank rose at a steep angle, its tracks clawing helplessly at dirt and roots polished by centuries of rain. As the front lifted, the massive machine unknowingly exposed its weakest armor. Thin, flat plating meant only to protect from debris. German soldiers hiding on the opposite side didn't have to aim. They just waited. 1 second of vulnerability, one rocket, one dead tank. Investigators would later say that no training manual, no reconnaissance report, no engineering handbook prepared the United States Army for this landscape. But Cullen didn't need official documents. He was watching the evidence smoldering in front of him. As he studied the wreck, he noted the position of the cracked suspension arms, the way the hull plating had peeled outward, the burn pattern on the soil. He wasn't looking at the tragedy, he was studying the mechanics of failure. Something in the way the tank had died was revealing a larger truth, a truth the command structure hadn't yet grasped. Passive, silent, unavoidable, and deadly. Cullen wiped soot from the tank's chassis and crouched lower until he could run his hand across the broken edges of the belly armor. The tear was clean, almost geometric. This wasn't chaos, this was physics. Around him the battlefield groaned. Distant gunfire, the rumble of engines, shouts carried by the wind. But his attention stayed fixed on the elegant precision with which the tank had been destroyed. Every inch of metal told the same story. climb the hedgerow, reveal the belly, die. Patterns like this didn't happen by accident. They hinted at a single underlying flaw, something brutal yet simple enough that it had gone unnoticed. And once Coulon saw the pattern, he couldn't unsee it. The way tanks interacted with it was. As the smell of burning fuel thickened around him, Curtis Coulon stood up, heart pounding, not with fear, but with the certainty that hundreds of American lives were about to be lost the exact same way unless someone changed the rules of the battlefield. And he already suspected there was only one man willing to try. Army, if anyone believed him. But to prove it, he would need evidence. And allies he didn't yet have. Curtis Coulon had never thought of himself as someone who changed the course of anything. Before the war, he spent his days hunched over carburetors and cracked radiators in a New Jersey garage, the kind of place where the smell of oil clung to your clothes no matter how many times you washed them. He was good with engines, good with leverage, good with machines that refused to cooperate. But none of that earned much respect in the hierarchy of the United States Army, where rank, not understanding, determined whose voice mattered. In Normandy, the disconnect between field experience and official doctrine was growing wider each day. Reports flowing up the chain of command described German resistance as fierce, coordinated, and fanatically entrenched. Yet Coulon, standing among the wrecks scattered like punctuation across the French countryside, saw something different. The Germans were not omnipresent. Often there were only a handful of them behind each hedgerow. What made them dangerous was the terrain, not their numbers. And the terrain was consuming American armor with the cold precision of a machine. Still, when he tried to explain what he was seeing, no one seemed willing to listen. He approached junior officers first, the ones who had not yet learned to hide behind procedures. They nodded politely as he described the geometry of the battlefield, the fatal angle created when a Sherman climbed a ridge. But their courtesy evaporated the moment he suggested that standard armored tactics were not just ineffective, but actively suicidal. They had checklists to follow, orders to obey, schedules to maintain. A mechanic pointing out systemic flaws in doctrine was an inconvenience, so Coulon shifted to the men who actually drove the tanks. These conversations were different. The drivers and loaders and gunners had felt the terror firsthand. They understood that the problem was not bravery or training, it was physics. When Coulon spoke to them, he noticed their expressions sharpen. They recognized the truth in what he was saying, because they were the ones trapped inside the metal coffins when the belly plate lifted. They told him stories of rolling over a hedgerow only to be met with a burst of fire that punched through like a nail through cardboard. They described the sickening moment when the nose of the tank tipped upward, transforming the machine into a target so vulnerable that it might as well have been painted red. These men were willing to share what they knew, but they had no authority to act on it. And none of them believed that the higher ranks would ever take their concerns seriously. Coulon wrote everything down, not dramatic accounts or emotional testimonies, just patterns. Impact angles, soil density, track slippage, time between cresting a ridge and detonation. His notebook became a collection of observations that pointed unmistakably toward a single conclusion. American tanks were being destroyed, not because of poor tactics or German superiority, but because they were fighting the terrain in the wrong way. The more he documented, the more he understood that the hedgerows were not random obstacles, but a man-made landscape with its own logic. Centuries of farmers had built these earthworks to survive storms, divide property, and protect livestock. Over generations, they hardened into barriers that withstood weather, erosion, and war. Nature had reinforced human labor until each hedgerow became a ramp, a shield, and a trap, all at once. Coulon recognized the scale of the challenge. He was confronting not just a battlefield problem, but a cultural assumption, a belief that tanks should always go over obstacles, never through them. This belief was woven into American armored doctrine, into training manuals, into the very identity of the armored corps. To question it was to question the foundation of mechanized warfare. He knew he needed evidence stronger than field notes, something undeniable, something physical. But gathering that proof meant venturing into areas where wreckage still smoldered, and the threat of hidden German positions lingered. The wrecked tanks drew him like artifacts waiting to be read, each one revealing clues about the moment of destruction. As he climbed onto yet another burned-out Sherman, he felt the weight of what he was trying to accomplish. He was a mechanic, not a theorist. His training did not include battlefield analysis or strategic planning. Yet here he was, assembling a case that could challenge the assumptions of generals. He paused, wiping grime from the torn metal. The evidence was overwhelming. The question was no longer whether the system had failed, but why no one wanted to acknowledge it. That evening, he returned to camp with a notebook full of sketches and measurements. He believed he finally had enough to approach someone with real authority. Someone who might listen, someone who might act. But he also knew that bringing this forward would place the burden squarely on his shoulders. If his conclusions were wrong, men would die because of him. If his conclusions were right, the army would have to admit that its own doctrine had been killing its crews since the moment the first tank rolled into Normandy. As night settled over the camp, Kulin realized that one detail in his notes did not fit the pattern, and that single inconsistency pointed toward a truth even more unsettling than the one he had already uncovered. Curtis Kulin spent most of that night sitting beside a lantern, flipping through the pages of his notebook as if a hidden message were buried between the lines. His notes from the wrecked tanks were thorough. Sketches, measurements, soil samples rubbed between his fingers to judge moisture, and observations collected like evidence in a criminal investigation. Each entry reinforced the same conclusion. The tanks were not failing in combat. They were failing in the instant they met the hedgerows. But a single observation refused to fit. One Sherman had not been destroyed the way the others had. It lay at the edge of a sunken lane, half swallowed by tall grass, as if the land itself were trying to hide it. Its belly plate was still intact. The hull was blistered from fire, but not pierced. And the angle of its final position did not match the others. Instead of being tipped upward, it was lodged nose downward, almost as if it had tried to force itself into the base of the hedgerow rather than climbing it. This deviation haunted Kulin because every anomaly in a pattern signaled something important. Machines broke in predictable ways. When they broke differently, there was always a cause. He returned to the site at dawn, before the camp fully stirred. The air was heavy with fog, muting the landscape into ghostly shapes. Kulin approached the wreck carefully, aware that the countryside was riddled with overlooked hazards, unexploded munitions, hidden German listening posts, pockets of sniper activity. Still, he needed to see the tank again. The soil around the nose of the Sherman told a story. It was churned in an arc, not a straight upward drag. The tracks had dug into the earth, pushing forward rather than lifting. The hull's front lip showed deep scratches angled downward, as though the tank had attempted to drive into the hedgerow instead of over it. This was the first physical sign that confirmed his suspicion. The terrain could be fought differently. The driver of this particular tank, whoever he had been, had tried something unconventional. Not doctrine, not training, instinct. An attempt to exploit the lower portion of the hedgerow rather than its crest. And though the crew had ultimately died from a fire caused by a secondary hit, their tank had not been exposed in the usual fatal way. The difference was subtle, but profound. Kulin crouched and brushed away mud until his fingers touched hardened roots. They were thick, twisted, woven like ancient ropes. For centuries, farmers had cut back the surface vegetation, leaving the underground structure to grow denser with time. These roots were the true armor of Normandy, but they were not an unbreakable wall. They were a barrier that could be pried apart if force was applied at the right location. While studying the roots, Cullen noticed something else. Embedded within the earth were fractured stones, placed deliberately long ago, perhaps as reinforcement or erosion control. They were angled downward, forming a hidden, sloped interior. If a tank could be made to attack this internal angle, rather than the exposed crown above, it might find purchase. It might break through. It might survive. That realization sent a jolt through him. None of the Army's standard procedures accounted for the internal geometry of these ancient structures. The manuals treated hedgerows like ordinary obstacles, not engineered fortifications hardened across generations. As he circled the tank, he pieced together the physics. If force were concentrated at the hedgerow's base, the mechanical advantage would shift. The tank would push into compacted earth and roots, tearing an opening rather than climbing a ramp. It would stay level, maintain frontal armor toward the enemy, and eliminate the deadly moment when the belly plate rose into view. It was a theory born from observation, not training, but it aligned with the anomaly he had found. The problem was not that tanks lacked power. It was that they lacked the means to apply it in the right place. Cullen stood and looked at the hedgerow as a machine, not a piece of terrain. It had an internal structure, load-bearing elements, and a weak point, just like any engine he had repaired in his years before the war. Mechanics taught him that every system, no matter how stubborn, had a point where leverage could defeat resistance. This hedgerow had one too. He wrote quickly, translating his thoughts into sketches. Diagrams of prongs, angles of penetration, vectors of force. The idea forming in his mind was strange enough that he hesitated to commit it fully to paper. It involved altering the very architecture of a Sherman tank, not adjusting tactics, not changing positioning, changing the machine itself. Such an idea was risky, if not reckless, and the Army did not appreciate reckless mechanics, but the image was now fixed in his mind. A tank reshaped to fight the terrain instead of the enemy first. A tank built to turn the hedgerow from a death trap into an entry point. As the sun burned away the fog, Cullen closed his notebook with a decisive snap. He did not yet have a solution. But for the first time, he understood the problem as a solvable one. And that meant he was now responsible for solving it, whether anyone wanted to hear his conclusions or not. What Cullen did not know was that the reason no one had noticed the anomaly before was simple. Someone in the chain of command had already tried to suppress it, and bringing his idea forward would force him into a confrontation he could not avoid. Curtis Cullen spent the next day moving through the forward camp with the uneasy feeling that he was carrying something dangerous, though nothing in his hands looked unusual. It was only a notebook, its pages filled with sketches and small calculations. But to him, it felt heavier than any piece of equipment he had handled since arriving in Normandy. Inside that notebook was a theory that challenged everything the armored units believed about how tanks were supposed to move, fight, and survive. The Army prided itself on being adaptable, but it was also bound to procedures that had been polished through years of training. There was a rhythm to armored warfare. Tanks advanced, infantry followed, engineers cleared obstacles. Deviating from that rhythm required not only evidence, but courage from those willing to endorse it. Cullen had the evidence. He was far less certain about the courage. Still, he knew he needed to speak to someone with decision-making authority, and that meant approaching officers who had little patience for a sergeant stepping outside his lane. He sought out the headquarters tent, where field maps lay spread across folding tables, and officers hunched over them with the exhausted intensity of men forced to make decisions that affected thousands. They were not engineers. They were strategists, logisticians, coordinators of manpower. Their desks were stacked with reports of casualties, fuel shortages, broken supply lines. They had no appetite for theories about soil composition or the physics of tank angles. When Cullen requested 5 minutes of their time, the expression on the first officer's face told him everything. It was not anger, just dismissal. The quiet kind that made clear how little his voice mattered in the hierarchy. He tried again with another officer, then another. Some listened for a moment, long enough for him to outline the idea that tanks needed to penetrate the base of hedgerows rather than climb them. But the moment he mentioned modifying the tanks themselves, the conversation ended. Equipment alterations required approvals, logistics routing, and engineering reviews. None of the officers were willing to put their names on such a request. They were fighting a timetable, not a theory. The rejection was not malicious. It was structural. In a war this large, a single mechanic's idea was not a priority, especially one that involved altering frontline vehicles. Yet something else bothered Cullen, the anomaly he had found in the sunken lane. Someone must have seen that wreck before him. Someone must have noted that it had not died like the others. And yet there were no reports, no analysis, no mention of it in any after-action summary. That absence hung over him. Late in the afternoon, he approached an engineering detachment stationed near the supply depot. They were responsible for bridge repairs, dozer operations, and general field construction. If anyone might understand the physical logic of his idea, it was them. He laid out the evidence clearly. The belly exposures, the root networks, the stones angled beneath the earth, the downward scratches on the anomalous Sherman. He expected skepticism. What he received was something far more surprising. One of the engineers, older, quiet, with deep grooves etched into his face, cut him off with a question delivered in a flat tone. "Where did you see that tank?" Cullen described the location precisely. The engineer nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though confirming something he already suspected. He exchanged glances with another member of his team. The reaction was not shock, it was recognition. That was when Cullen understood. The anomaly had not been overlooked. It had been noticed and intentionally ignored. The engineer finally spoke. He explained that a few crews had tried unconventional approaches out of desperation. Some attempted to dig into hedgerows using improvised methods. Others damaged their suspensions trying to ram the earth at odd angles. None survived long enough to report what happened. Their tanks were recovered. Their remains sent back. Their stories never recorded in a way that influenced doctrine. Failure, not innovation, had been documented. Anything that deviated from the established tactic of climbing the ridge was categorized as driver error. The Army did not have the luxury of investigating unapproved improvisation. It simply labeled them mistakes and moved on. The implication unsettled Cullen. Innovation had already happened, several times from several crews. But without an advocate, their attempts died alongside them. That left him as the only surviving witness to a pattern the Army had quietly dismissed. The engineer studied Cullen's sketches for a long moment before handing them back. "Even if you're right," he said, "no one up the chain will approve a modification without a prototype. And they won't authorize building a prototype without proof it works." Cullen absorbed the words carefully. A prototype required metal, tools, time, and permission. Resources tightly controlled at the front. But the engineering detachment had unintentionally given him something far more valuable. Confirmation that he was not imagining the problem. The system had failed, not the evidence. As he left the depot, he realized that the path ahead would force him to challenge that system directly. And that meant risking not just his idea, but his reputation, his standing in the ranks, and perhaps even his position in the unit. Because the only way forward was to build something the Army had already tried to bury once. That night, as he lay awake staring at the canvas ceiling of his tent, Cullen understood that there was only one way to move his idea forward, and it required a damaged tank, a cutting torch, and a supply of scrap metal no one would voluntarily give him. Curtis Cullen woke before sunrise, long before the camp stirred, with a clarity that bordered on defiance. The idea that had formed in his notebook had grown into something larger than theory. It pressed against him like a physical weight, demanding action. He knew that the Army command would not approve experimental modifications. They had neither the time nor the willingness to gamble on a mechanic's hunch. But if he waited for permission, the tanks would continue to die the same predictable deaths. So he decided to stop waiting. He walked toward the motor pool where the wreck repairs were handled. The air carried the familiar smell of diesel, scorched paint, and hot steel, an atmosphere that felt almost safer to him than the open fields beyond the hedgerows. Rows of damaged vehicles stood in silence, each one marked by the violence it had endured. Some were too mangled to save. Others had been stripped for parts. One of them would become the starting point for his experiment. He found a Sherman that had taken a hit to its rear, rendering its engine block useless, but leaving the frontal armor intact. It sat tilted on uneven ground, abandoned by necessity rather than choice. To Cullen, it was exactly what he needed, a test platform no one would miss. He checked to make sure the officers responsible for the motor pool were not nearby. They rarely arrived this early, but he could not afford to be seen. Unauthorized work on government equipment was not just frowned upon. It could end his career or land him in detention. Still, he reached for the cutting torch. The design in his notebook was deceptively simple. A set of metal prongs that would be welded to the front of the tank, positioned to dig into the base of a hedgerow and pry it apart. It relied on leverage, momentum, and the natural shape of the terrain. To prove the concept, he did not need precision machining. He needed something sturdy enough to survive a single test. He scavenged scrap steel from discarded track guards and damaged tow hooks. The pieces were thick, irregular, already bent from previous impacts, perfect raw material. He cut them to shape, grinding edges and testing each piece for flexibility and fracture lines. Every movement was deliberate, grounded in the instincts he had developed over years spent repairing machines others considered unsalvageable. By the time the camp began to wake, he had assembled the rough outline of the device. It looked crude, almost primitive, an improvised construction born of urgency rather than engineering finesse. But it had teeth. Real, purposeful teeth. All he needed now was a welder. The welding station was guarded more closely. It was part of the official repair infrastructure, and borrowing equipment without permission was risky. Cullen waited until the mechanic assigned to the station stepped out to retrieve replacement rods. Then he moved quickly. The welding mask dropped over his face. Sparks erupted. Steel glowed orange beneath his hands. He worked with the steady urgency of someone who knows the clock is against him, but refuses to rush. The prongs fused to the tank's frontal plate with a strength that felt almost symbolic, as though he were welding his conviction into the machine itself. When he finished, he stepped back and examined the result. It was rough, asymmetrical, and far from beautiful. But it embodied the logic of his idea. Attack the hedgerow at its base, not its crown. Testing the device, however, required more than craftsmanship. It required movement. And movement meant fuel, crew, and the risk of being discovered by the officers who would shut the experiment down before it ever touched a hedgerow. Cullen considered these obstacles carefully. He needed help, but asking directly would expose him to consequences he could not control. Instead, he approached a small group of enlisted men who had lost friends inside the hedgerows during the first days of the campaign. They trusted him. They respected his eye for machines. And most importantly, they understood the stakes. He explained the device in plain terms. No theory, no diagrams. Just the truth. If his idea worked, it could save lives. Lives like those they had already buried. The men listened without interruption. Then, one by one, they agreed to assist. They moved with the practiced coordination of soldiers accustomed to improvisation. Fuel was siphoned. A radio was disabled to avoid unwanted attention. The tank came to life with a guttural churn, the engine struggling but functional enough for a low-speed test. Colin climbed onto the side of the hole as the tank rolled forward. The sound was louder than he had anticipated, a noise that might attract the wrong kind of audience if these officers happened to be nearby. But backing out now would waste everything he had worked for. The hedgerow stood ahead, a dark, looming wall of roots and earth. The sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows across the landscape. It felt like a moment suspended between certainty and disaster. The driver glanced at Cullen. Cullen nodded. The tank accelerated gently. The modified prongs slammed into the base of the hedgerow. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the earth shifted. The roots trembled, strained, and began to tear. The tank did not lift. It did not angle upward. It pushed forward, cleaving into the structure the way Cullen had envisioned. It was working. But before Cullen could celebrate, a shout erupted from behind them. Someone had seen the unauthorized test. The figure running toward the tank was not an officer. It was someone far worse for Cullen's plans. Someone with the authority to shut down his work permanently, and the discipline to ensure the consequences would be severe. The shout cut through the morning air with an authority that froze everyone in place. The tank's engine rumbled on, the prongs buried deep in the torn earth of the hedgerow. But the small crew fell silent as they turned toward the figure sprinting across the field. It was the battalion maintenance chief. He was not a man easily ignored. His uniform was worn, his boots caked with grease and dried mud, and his voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to disciplining mechanics who stepped out of line. He had decades of experience behind him, and though he outranked Cullen only modestly, his influence stretched far beyond what his insignia suggested. If he declared a project unsafe or insubordinate, that was the end of it. No appeal, no reconsideration, and he was running directly toward them. Cullen climbed down from the tank, wiping sweat and soot from his face. The others backed away instinctively, knowing the conversation that was coming was not theirs to join. The chief slowed as he approached, eyes fixed on the prongs jutting from the Sherman's bow. He said nothing at first. He simply stared. The silence felt heavier than the steel they had just welded. The damaged hedgerow behind the tank stood as undeniable evidence of what the device had achieved. The roots hung shredded and exposed, a wound carved into a barrier that had stopped countless tanks before it. The machine remained level, its hull unlifted, its vulnerable underbelly hidden. It had done the impossible. But the chief was not looking for innovation. He was looking for violations. "You want to tell me," he finally said, his voice low, "why one of my tanks looks like it grew teeth overnight?" Colin braced himself. He had expected anger, maybe even orders placing him under formal reprimand. But the tone held something more complicated, disbelief mixed with irritation, but not outright hostility. He explained the concept as clearly as he could. He described the destroyed tanks he had studied, the anomaly in the sunken lane, the field notes, the internal structure of the hedgerows. He outlined the failure of doctrine and the urgent need for a new approach. He spoke quickly but carefully, knowing that every word had to justify the unauthorized work behind him. The chief listened without interrupting. He had seen too many mechanics talk themselves into disciplinary trouble by rambling or over-defending their actions. Cullen kept his explanation grounded in evidence, not ambition. The chief's expression shifted slightly as he turned to inspect the torn hedgerow up close. He crouched, ran his glove along the exposed roots, then stepped back to study the prongs welded to the tank. "What you built," he finally said, "is not regulation." Coulon exhaled slowly. "I know. It is not approved by the armored branch. I know. And you tested it with personnel who were not trained for unauthorized experimental operations. I know." The chief paused, eyes locking on Coulon's with a sharpness that felt like a verdict being delivered. "But," he added, "it clearly works." The words landed with the force of a revelation. For a man as rigid as the chief, acknowledging success outside of procedure was rare. It signaled something Coulon had not dared hope for. The possibility of collaboration rather than punishment. The chief walked around the tank once more, inspecting the welds with practiced scrutiny. "The craftsmanship is sloppy," he said. "The alignment is off. The right prong is angled a bit too far inward." Coulon nodded. "I can fix that." "I'm not finished," the chief said. "The steel is mismatched. The load distribution is questionable. And if you try this at higher speed, you risk tearing the entire structure off." Again, Coulon nodded. "I can reinforce it." "And you will." The chief stood upright, the finality in his voice unmistakable. "Because if this fails, I want it to fail, because it is a bad idea. Not because it was built like a barn gate." Coulon blinked. This was not just permission, it was involvement. The chief leaned closer, lowering his voice so the others could not hear. "Make no mistake," he said. "You are in violation of protocol. If anyone above my rank sees this before it is ready, I will have no choice but to shut it down. So if you want to continue this little experiment, you do it under my supervision. Quietly, efficiently, and with no room for error." A weight lifted from Coulon's chest, replaced by something sharper. Responsibility. He had expected opposition. Instead, he had gained an unlikely ally, one who could protect the project, refine it, and give it substance that command might take seriously. But the chief's eyes carried another warning. "Understand something," he added. "If this works, it will change how we fight in this region. If it fails, it will bury more than your career. So before we proceed, you tell me, are you certain of what you saw in that wrecked tank?" Coulon hesitated for the first time, not because he doubted his observations, but because he realized the stakes were larger than he had understood. This was not just an experiment. It was a challenge to the established order of armored warfare, and he had just bound the fate of his idea to a man who demanded results, not theories. "I am certain," Coulon said. The chief studied him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. Then he nodded once, sharply. "Good. Then we start tonight." But as they returned to camp, neither man knew that an unexpected report had just been filed to headquarters, one that would force a far more powerful officer to take interest in the strange modifications appearing on a Sherman in the motor pool. The report reached headquarters almost by accident, carried not by intent, but by routine. A junior logistics officer, tasked with documenting equipment irregularities, had noticed the altered Sherman during an inspection round. He did not understand what he was seeing, just that a tank bore unauthorized structural changes. His duty required him to file it, so he did, without knowing that a single line in a daily dispatch could interrupt the chain of events happening quietly at the motor pool. For the moment, Curtis Coulon knew nothing about it. He spent the evening working under the dim glow of hooded lamps, surrounded by the smell of heated steel and grinding sparks. The battalion maintenance chief hovered nearby, arms crossed, issuing corrections with the sharp efficiency of a man unwilling to tolerate shortcuts. The improvised prongs were removed, straightened, reforged, and reattached at a more precise angle, Reinforcement plates were added. Weight distribution was recalculated, using chalk lines drawn directly on the hull. What began as a quiet act of disobedience was becoming a serious engineering project. Coulon focused on every weld, as though the success of the entire campaign depended on the thickness of each seam. In some ways, he believed it did. The hedgerows had turned the battlefield into a grinding stalemate, consuming American armor faster than replacements could arrive. The prongs were more than metal. They were a potential shift in momentum. By midnight, the device had taken on a new shape. No longer crude scrap, it resembled something designed rather than improvised. The chief instructed Coulon to rest, but Coulon refused. Fatigue made his hands unsteady, but determination sharpened his attention. He had carried this idea alone long enough. Now it lived on steel, sharpened and ready. But it was the following morning that everything changed. A jeep arrived from headquarters, kicking up dust as it rolled to a stop near the motor pool. Officers rarely visited the maintenance area unannounced. The moment the vehicle halted, the chief's expression shifted, tightening into the look of someone who sensed trouble before any words were spoken. A major stepped out. Not a high-ranking officer, but high enough that his presence meant oversight, not curiosity. His uniform was crisp compared to the frontline wear around him. He carried a folder under his arm, and as he approached, he looked directly at the modified Sherman. "So," the major said, "this is the tank." The chief stepped forward immediately, calm but wary. "Sir, this is an internal repair matter. Routine adjustments after salvage work." "Routine?" The major raised an eyebrow. It appears someone welded a new front end onto a frontline vehicle. Coulon felt his stomach tighten. The men who had helped with the test remained silent, standing in the background like shadows hoping not to be noticed. The major opened the folder and scanned the report. Unauthorized modification, unauthorized use of welding equipment, unauthorized movement of disabled armor, unauthorized testing. He paused. A pattern seems to be forming. Coulon stepped forward before the chief could speak. "Sir, I can explain everything." The major closed the folder slowly. "I doubt that. But you can try," so Coulon told him. Not hurriedly and not defensively. He described the hedgerow problem, the vulnerabilities exposed by the terrain, the destroyed tanks, the anomaly no one had documented, the logic of attacking the base instead of the crest. He explained how the prongs worked, what the test had shown, and why the device mattered. The major listened with an expression that revealed nothing. When Coulon finished, an uncomfortable silence fell over the motor pool. The major stepped closer to the tank, running his hand along the welded prong as though testing the idea simply by touching it. "You're a mechanic," he said, "not an engineer." "Yes, sir. You are not authorized to redesign wartime equipment." "I understand that, sir. And you conducted an experiment that could have resulted in severe injury." "I understand that as well." The major tapped the steel with his knuckle. "But I also understand something else. This region has cost us far too many tanks, more than anyone expected. More than anyone will admit publicly. And I have heard whispers about unrecorded crew improvisations. None of them survived long enough to produce evidence." He turned to Coulon. "Except now." Coulon stayed silent, unsure whether the major was building toward approval or condemnation. The major looked at the chief. "Who supervised this?" The chief answered without hesitation. "I did." The major nodded once, acknowledging the risk that answer carried. Then he closed the folder and held it at his side. "I should shut this down," he said evenly. "I should order the removal of every modification and file charges for violation of procedure." Coulon felt the world tighten, as if everything he had built were about to collapse. But the major continued, "I am not blind to results. And I am not foolish enough to dismiss a solution because it came from a mechanic instead of a command desk. He glanced back at the battered hedgerow marked by the test. The question now, he said quietly, is not whether this works. It is whether it can be replicated, installed, and deployed before the next offensive. Before anyone could respond, the Major lifted the folder and opened it again. And that means I need to show this to someone else. Cullen exchanged a look with the chief. This was no longer a hidden experiment. It was becoming visible, dangerously visible, to higher levels of command. The Major stepped into the jeep, preparing to leave. But before he did, he turned back. "Be prepared," he said. "Because the officer I am bringing here next will decide your future, and possibly the future of the entire armored division." And the man the Major intended to bring was known for ending careers as swiftly as he approved innovations, making the next encounter the most perilous moment of Cullen's gamble yet. The Major returned 2 days later, but this time he did not come alone. The jeep rolled into the motor pool with a different posture, straighter, faster, purposeful. Dust rose behind it like a wake. The man seated beside the driver wore a helmet with a single white bar painted across the front, a mark that carried more weight than the insignia on his collar. He was a division-level officer, the kind whose signature redirected entire battalions and whose judgment shaped the fate of strategies, not single machines. His name was Colonel Nathaniel Hale, and among the enlisted men, Hale was known for only 2 things: efficiency and intolerance for improvisation. Cullen and the battalion chief stood near the modified Sherman as the jeep halted. Hale climbed out with the stiff precision of someone accustomed to commanding attention simply by existing. He took in the scene, the tools, the weld marks, the prongs, without speaking. His silence had the effect of a blade sliding from its sheath. The Major saluted. The chief saluted. Cullen did as well. Hale did not immediately return the gesture. Instead, he walked straight to the front of the Sherman and placed a hand on the welded device. He pressed against the steel, tested its rigidity, then stepped back and circled the machine with the meticulous, predatory focus of a man who measured people by the quality of their work long before he measured their rank. "You built this?" Hale asked. His voice was controlled, but its severity was unmistakable. Cullen answered, "Yes, sir." "You designed it?" "Yes, sir." "And you tested it without authorization?" "Yes, sir." Hale's jaw tightened slightly. The chief's stance shifted, ready to intervene if necessary, but the colonel raised one hand to stop him. Hale's attention never left Cullen. "I want to hear," Hale said, "exactly what possessed a mechanic to redesign one of my frontline tanks." Cullen inhaled and explained. Not the same way he had spoken to the Major, nor the way he had spoken to the chief. Hale was not a man swayed by emotion, nor by desperation. He respected problems that could be quantified, measured, replicated. So Cullen spoke in the language of practical combat mathematics. Angles of exposure, armor vulnerability, root density, track resistance, structural weaknesses in the hedgerow base. Hale listened in complete stillness. When Cullen finished, Hale stepped to the torn hedgerow where the first test had taken place. The wound was still visible. Roots snapped like sinew, earth displaced, the shape of force unmistakable, a natural barrier defeated not by speed or firepower, but by leverage. Hale crouched, studying the exposed layers. When he rose, he turned to the Major. "You said this tank penetrated the hedgerow without lifting?" "Yes, sir." "And you witnessed it?" "Yes, sir." Hale looked back at Cullen. "You understand the implications of what you're claiming," he said. "If this is true, truly reliable, it changes the geometry of this entire campaign." "Yes, sir," Cullen said quietly. "Do you also understand," Hale continued, that if it fails under combat conditions, it will cost lives? Yes, sir. I do. Hale's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but in assessment. For a moment, the motor pool felt impossibly still. Even the men who had helped with the experiment held their breath, waiting to see which direction the colonel would choose: destruction of the idea or acceptance of risk. Then Hale asked a single question. Can you reproduce this device on other tanks? The chief stepped in. With materials, manpower, and a small amount of time. Yes. But the design needs refinement. Hale nodded once. Then refine it. Coulon stared at him, unsure whether he had heard correctly. Hale continued. I will not present an improvised device to command. Not until it is stable, reliable, and tested under controlled conditions. If it breaks, I will shut this down myself. If it works, it will not remain a motor pool secret. It will become division doctrine. The weight of those words settled over the group. Hale turned toward the men. Effective immediately, this tank is removed from regular assignment. You will construct 2 additional prototypes. One will be used for stress testing. One will be prepared for a field demonstration. Coulon felt a surge of adrenaline. A demonstration meant visibility. Visibility meant possibility and danger. If the idea succeeded, it would spread. If it failed, it would collapse in front of officers who would not tolerate embarrassment. Hale approached Coulon once more, lowering his voice so only he could hear. And understand this, he said. If we proceed, your name becomes attached to this project. Which means, if anything goes wrong, the responsibility is not mine, it is yours. Coulon nodded. I accept that, sir. Hale held his gaze for a long moment, searching for hesitation. Finding none, he stepped back and signaled to the major. Begin preparations, he ordered. This division moves soon. I want answers before we do. The jeep engine roared to life. Dust rose again as the colonel departed the motor pool, leaving behind a silence filled not with fear, but with the tension of something larger taking shape. Coulon stood beside the modified Sherman, the reality settling over him. The device was no longer an experiment. It had become a responsibility. But hours later, as work began on the next prototype, a new problem emerged, one that threatened not only the project, but the reputation of everyone involved. And it came from an unexpected place. The numbers no longer matched what Coulon had calculated. By the following morning, the motor pool felt less like a repair site and more like an improvised laboratory. Sheets of scrap steel were stacked like raw ingredients. Welding rigs hissed and sputtered in controlled rhythms. Men moved with purpose, their conversations clipped, practical, impatient. Colonel Hale's orders had transformed the atmosphere. What had begun as a quiet act of defiance was now an official project. One under intense scrutiny, Curtis Coulon walked between workbenches, studying measurements chalked onto metal plates. Every piece mattered. Every weld line mattered. The redesigned prongs needed consistency, durability, symmetry. The slightest deviation in angle or thickness could turn success into mechanical failure. Hale had made the stakes clear, and Coulon felt the weight of those expectations pressing against his chest. Then the chief approached with a clipboard in hand. We have a problem, he said. Coulon glanced up. What kind of problem? The numbers, the chief replied. They are not matching your calculations. Coulon frowned, wiping grime from his hands. That is not possible. The chief's expression held no argument, only concern. He handed over the clipboard. Coulon scanned the notes. Stress tolerances, distribution loads, shear resistance, expected force at impact. These were not theoretical numbers. They were benchmarks essential for the device to survive repeated use. And they were wrong, not wildly off, but off enough that the prongs would warp under sustained pressure. enough that a single high-speed hit could snap the welds clean through. Cullen felt a cold ripple of unease. "I checked these calculations myself," he said quietly. "I know you did," the chief answered. "And I know you did them correctly. But they do not account for something." Cullen looked up sharply. "What?" "The shape of the Sherman hull." Cullen blinked. "The hull?" The chief nodded. "Not the armor. The frame beneath it. The one detail most mechanics never deal with unless they are doing heavy structural refurbishing." He motioned for Cullen to follow, leading him beneath the raised chassis of a stripped-down Sherman. The hull hung suspended by chains, its underbelly exposed. The chief tapped a broad section of steel with the back of his wrench. "This," he said, "is not uniform. It looks uniform. It should be uniform. But the factory that produced this batch was under wartime pressure. They rushed production. Some of these frames are slightly warped before they even reach the field." Cullen took a slow, steady breath. "How many tanks are affected?" he asked. The chief lifted his eyes toward him. "Enough to make your numbers unreliable." The realization settled over Cullen like a weight dropped from a height. The entire premise of the device rested not only on physics, but on consistent structural support. If the hull flexed upward even slightly under pressure, the force distribution would shift. The prongs would no longer act as a wedge. They would bind inside the hedgerow and jerk the tank off balance. In other words, catastrophic failure. He stepped back, absorbing the implications. The men building the prototypes had trusted his designs. Colonel Hale had staked his reputation on the coming demonstration. If the prongs failed in front of officers from division headquarters, or worse, in combat, the project would not merely collapse. It would mark Cullen as reckless, irresponsible, dangerous. The chief watched him carefully. "This does not mean your idea is wrong," he said. "It means the tanks are inconsistent. You need to design the device to compensate for variations." Cullen shook his head slowly. "But that means changing the angles, changing the distribution plates, changing the weld depth." "Yes," the chief said. "It means redesigning all of it." Cullen clenched the clipboard tightly. "There is no time for a full redesign," he said. "There is no time not to redesign," the chief countered. The words struck with the force of truth. Cullen looked around at the motor pool. Men welding, men adjusting brackets, men shaping steel that might, at this moment, be wrong. They were building something that would either change the course of battle or break under pressure. The chief spoke again, his tone measured. "A flawed innovation kills faster than a bad doctrine. You must fix the flaws before Hale sees the next prototype." Cullen stared at the numbers on the clipboard, searching for the source of the discrepancy. For hours, he recalculated. He remeasured hull variance. He tested the load distribution on multiple tanks built at different factories. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The hull warping was not random. It followed a predictable bias depending on factory origin. Manufacturing shortcuts, wartime urgency, variations in steel tempering. It meant only one thing: he could compensate for it. A new idea formed in his mind, not a replacement for the prongs, but an adaptation. Braces angled not forward, but downward, absorbing flex before the force could transfer to the welds. It was not elegant, it was not beautiful, but it was practical. He spent the entire afternoon sketching, discarding, revising, testing angles with scrap frames. The chief assisted silently, offering occasional corrections. Both men worked with the intensity of surgeons racing a clock. As dusk fell, Cullen finally stepped back. The redesign was ready, stronger, more stable, adaptable to factory inconsistencies. "We can build this," he said. The chief nodded. "We can. But you should know something." Coolin wiped sweat from his face. What? The chief hesitated. The major sent word. Colonel Hale is bringing additional officers to witness the demonstration. High-ranking ones. Coolin exhaled slowly. How many? He asked. The chief folded his arms. Enough that if this fails, it will be remembered for a long time. Coolin looked down at the new design, understanding the stakes entirely. This test was no longer about proving an idea. It was about avoiding disaster. And as the sun disappeared behind the hedgerows, an unexpected messenger arrived with news that threatened to derail everything, because the frontline schedule had just changed, and the demonstration would no longer be held in the safety of the motor pool. It would be held in the field. Under fire, the message arrived just after nightfall, delivered by a runner who looked as though he had sprinted straight from the front. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with sweat and dust. He handed a folded order to the battalion chief, saluted shakily, and disappeared back into the dark. The chief read it once, exhaled hard, and handed it to Curtis Coolin. The contents were brief. The frontline timetable had shifted. Division command needed a breakthrough along a critical hedgerow line at dawn. Colonel Hale's demonstration would not take place in the safety of the motor pool. It would occur in the field, in view of enemy positions, under real combat conditions. Coolin did not speak for several seconds. The redesigned prongs had not yet been tested at full speed. They had not met a hedgerow reinforced with stone. They had not been subjected to live fire, but the schedule left no room for hesitation. It was either attempt the demonstration in battle, or watch the idea die before it ever lived. The chief placed a hand on his shoulder. This is what happens when an idea becomes too visible. The war will use it before command decides whether it is ready. At first light, the modified Sherman rolled toward the assembly area. The new braces, welded through the night, gleamed silver against the hull. The crew climbed aboard with a solemn awareness that they were not just tankers today. They were test pilots for a weapon that might fail in the worst possible moment. Colonel Hale arrived with a cluster of officers trailing behind him. Their faces were drawn and tense. None spoke as they surveyed the tank. To them, this was not innovation. It was a gamble. A risk taken on the word of a mechanic who had stepped outside the lines of protocol. Hale approached Coolin directly. "We have little time," Hale said. "Infantry is stalled along the ridge. German positions are fortified. If your device works, it will open a breach wide enough for the armored column to move. If it does not..." He paused, but the unspoken consequences hung between them. "Are your calculations sound?" Coolin met his eyes. "They are." Hale nodded once, nothing more, and signaled to the tank commander. "Begin." The Sherman growled to life. Its treads churned through the soft earth as it rolled toward a hedgerow that had become a graveyard for several tanks earlier in the week. Smoke drifted across the fields. Artillery thundered in the distance. The morning air carried the sharp, metallic smell of imminent battle. Infantry took cover, clearing a path. Officers watched from foxholes and depressions, some skeptical, some desperate. The Germans were dug in beyond the hedgerow, their machine guns already probing the approach with sporadic fire. The tank accelerated. Coolin stood beside Hale, breath locked in his chest. Everything. The notes, the sketches, the arguments, the failures, the redesign, came down to this single moment. The Sherman reached the hedgerow. It did not climb. It drove. The prongs struck the base with a force that rippled through the ground. The braces absorbed the impact. The welds held. The soil buckled. Roots snapped. The hedgerow shuddered like a living thing taking a final breath. Then it split. Not gracefully. Not silently. But with the raw violence of centuries of earthwork tearing apart. The tank kept moving. It punched through the barrier, emerging on the other side level, stable, and immediately bringing its main gun to bear on German positions. Infantry surged behind it, shouting, sprinting, taking advantage of the opening. Machine gun nests ahead faltered, thrown off balance by a breach they had believed impossible. Hale watched without blinking. Another tank followed, then another, each fitted overnight with the modified device built from Kuhlen's design. Hedgerow after hedgerow shattered as the armored column advanced in a pattern the Germans had not prepared for. Their defenses fractured, their firing lanes collapsed. What had been a stalemate turned into momentum. For the first time since arriving in Normandy, the hedgerows were no longer a fortress. They were simply terrain. When the firing finally slowed and the smoke thinned, Hale turned toward Kuhlen. The colonel's expression, usually carved from stone, held something almost unfamiliar. Acknowledgement. "You changed the battlefield," Hale said, "in one night." Kuhlen exhaled only then, feeling exhaustion crash through him. The chief stepped beside him, nodding once in approval, as if to confirm that the risks taken in secret had been justified in daylight. By evening, word spread across the division. The device was already earning a name among the troops, an informal, unpolished nickname born from frontline humor. They called it the Kuhlen Cutter. Within days, motor pools across the region began welding their own versions, adapting scrap steel and abandoned German obstacles into the same destructive prongs. What began as an unauthorized experiment had become doctrine. And though Kuhlen never asked for recognition, the truth settled quietly over the men who had witnessed the breakthrough. Sometimes the course of a campaign changes not from strategy written in headquarters, but from insight born in a mechanic's notebook. As night settled over the newly breached fields, the modified tanks idled in silence. Steel giants no longer stopped by ancient barriers, but reshaped to conquer them. And Curtis Kuhlen, standing among them, finally understood what he had done. Not invent a new weapon, not break a rule,